and I have the esteemed pleasure to introduce or welcome here Jack Jones, who probably needs no introduction. He's the global thought leader in all things risk management and quantification, and chairman emeritus for the FAIR Institute, as well as the author of FAIR and FAIR CAM. So he's here today to give us some insights into his new work around FAIR CAM and other aspects of FAIR with AI. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jack. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everyone coming to this. I assume many of you are at least somewhat familiar with FAIR CAM and what that is, but I won't. I will have a few slides here just to give a high-level view of FAIR CAM for those who are less familiar with it. So let me dive in. And we'll go through some slides, but then we'll get into what I hope is the fun part, which is a demonstration of this custom GPT I've created. So, all right, in the practice of medicine, if we were speaking with a physician, if we were to ask them what's more important in their practice, knowing anatomy or physiology, hopefully their answer would be, well, neither. You need to know both. You need to know the parts of the body, but you also need to know how those parts work both individually and as a complex system, right? Unfortunately, in our profession, historically, we've only had anatomy to work from. You know, the frameworks and such that we know and love, the ISOs of the world and the NIST CSFs of the world and whatnot, they describe what I refer to as the anatomical component of a security program. Here are the things that can or should be part of your program. What they don't do is describe in any meaningful way how those things work to affect risk in a real practical way, and they certainly don't go into sort of the systemic nature of how those controls work together, which is kind of fascinating once you get into it. So FAIR CAM in 30 seconds, and CAM stands for Controls Analytics Model. So it's really going from lists of controls, again, these frameworks we're familiar with, to what our levers are for the decision making and management around risk management. So the problem, we've mastered anatomy. Okay, we know the different components that can or should be part of the program. I've already talked about FAIR CAM being a model of how these things work together. And this allows us to prioritize our resource allocation in a very different way. And there can be some pretty significant surprises once you dig into this physiological component of the problem space. And to be clear, it doesn't replace the frameworks we're familiar with. It complements them, it supports them, it provides more context for the value they provide. So again, very briefly here, if we think about risk being an outcome of having assets and threats against assets, and we put controls in place. But if we get a little more specific and we define something, instead of just sort of generic controls, we think of them as loss event controls and the functions that these controls form. These are things that directly affect the frequency or magnitude of loss, and we'll see examples of this here in a minute. But we also have another domain within FAIR CAM, which is variance management controls. These are the controls that affect the reliability of other controls. And then the third domain is decision support controls. It allows us to make better informed decisions about risk management and whatnot. But the key point here is variance management and decision support don't affect risk directly. They affect it through their downstream effect on loss event controls. We'll see an example of that here in a second. So let's take ransomware, for example. What are some of the common ransomware controls? Well, anti-phishing training, multi-factor authentication, anti-malware, et cetera, right? A whole bunch of them. But how much does each of them reduce ransomware risk? Maybe before we can answer that question, we have to answer the question, how did them reduce risk? How did they reduce risk, right? It isn't just a matter of how much. We first have to know how before we get to the much part. So if we look at, again, this sort of diagram, three-domain diagram, and let's say we're worried about a ransomware outage, we know that personnel are a resistive control against phishing attacks. okay? They get a phishing email, they click or they don't click, right? Their ability to recognize and resist the urge to click makes them a resistive control, right? They're a loss event control, if you will. But they aren't alone. We have anti-malware and these other controls that are relevant in the ransomware problem space as well. But we also have these variance management and decision support controls that play a role. So anti-phishing training, helping these personnel make better decisions about click or don't click, right? But how good your anti-phishing training is a function of how good your threat intelligence is. If your threat intelligence is poor, your training is going to be poor, and therefore your personnel as a resistive control are not going to be as effective. But how effective any of that is, we can only learn through testing. Well, we can learn it through loss events too, but let's hope for testing to be the source of that intelligence. So you can begin to see the relationships between these controls, right? No control fails on its own. It is a system. But even let's say that for whatever reason, our personnel aren't good at resisting phishing attacks, right? They too quick to click. And maybe that's because some of these other controls aren't working well. But maybe that really doesn't matter much, because how much any one control matters depends on how well the other controls that are in play are working, right? So we can't gauge how significant a deficiency in, say, personnel is unless we know how well the others are working. And you can bet that each of those others has variance management and decision support controls that affect how good they are as well, right? So again, this is a system. And we have to understand it as a system before we can really manage it effectively and leverage it effectively. The downside is FairCam is relatively new, and as hard as I'm trying, I haven't been able to get as much good documentation out there for people to use as I'd like. But it's coming but slowly. So I created this custom GPT that is an expert in FAIR. It's free for anyone to use for any reason. And some of the use cases are to learn FairCam itself. You can use it as a tutor to understand how FairCam works. You can have it map controls, these anatomical control frameworks, to FairCam. What functions does this control or that control work or serve? Metrics development, it's very good at metrics. Developing metrics for security programs. Analysis support, if you're doing a FAIR analysis and you have some question or concern about controls within the analysis and determining the operational efficacy of a control, it can help you with that. Strategic decision support, explaining how controls affect risk, development of FairCam teaching materials. If, for example, you have a university program or something like that, or you just want to teach in a local chapter of some sort, right? ISSA or ISC squared chapter sort of thing. And it'll code up FairCam-enabled apps, too. Now, it has not been, I think, well trained for that. I would exercise caution in this, but it is very capable of doing it with the right guidance. So if you go out to the URL for this FairCam Assistant, it's on the OpenAI site. It's built upon OpenAI's ChatGPT 5 in their community builder program. You will see this screen, and I know you probably can't read it where you're sitting. But up here is where you get to sort of, there's a drop down there, and you can choose the thinking mode, the quick and dirty sort of responses, or really deeply thought through responses by the GPT. You can also start new chat sessions and whatnot with it. But all that's up there. And you can see it's in thinking mode right now, that sort of grayed out word at the end of that phrase says thinking. So, and that's the recommended mode, because that's the right, in my experience, it's the right combination or trade-off between how long you have to wait for your response and the quality of the response. Now, in the live demo we'll do here in a few minutes, we'll be in instant answer mode, which I do not recommend for real decision making. It's not bad, but I think it's worth waiting a few minutes for a stronger answer. That's user beware. Here are some example prompts that, again, someone just coming onto this site for the first time might click on these to get a sense for how it behaves. And we'll see a little bit more about that. This prompt here takes you to a list of prompts, which, again, we'll see here in a minute, because I really wanted to give new users to this a sense of the breadth of things it's capable of. So there's this longer list. And this is the list you'll see if you click on that button. Example prompts. So explain how control operational efficacy works, describe each of the FairCam's functions, et cetera, right? A whole bunch of different things. This one is provide a recommended set of controls that provide thorough functional coverage against a ransomware attack. And where appropriate, provide examples of vendor products that serve those functions. That could be useful, and actually we'll run that. You'll see that. Provide program-level metrics my organization should be tracking and reporting to executives. It'll offer an opinion on that too. Again, materials for university course. But because there are people who are not fans of models, let's just say, I included here, for example, what are the key weaknesses or limitations of FairCam? And are those weaknesses or limitations due to the model, or do they represent challenges any similar model would face? I think that's a useful thing to understand. I don't think anybody should ever use a model they don't understand. I think there's danger there. Okay? So if you use this, I encourage you to click on that and look at how it answers and see if it makes sense to you. Challenge it. Has the efficacy of FairCam been proven? It'll answer that too. Isn't FairCam too complicated to be practical? It'll answer that. I think that's a useful question because a lot of the feedback or pushback I've gotten, most feedback, thankfully, I get on FairCam is really positive, but I also hear people go, oh, it's too complicated. Okay. It'll talk about that. It'll also say, or answer the question, how can I apply FairCam qualitatively rather than quantitatively? Because you can. Okay. So, a lot of things it can cover. Down here, though, is something I think is important because it'll answer your questions assuming you have some foundation in FairCam, which not everybody does. So you can, if you ask it a question, it'll provide maybe a harder to digest response, but you can then just say simplify it, and it'll give you a plain language answer. Right? If you don't have a background in FairCam. You can tell it to skip the math because it'll sometimes, depending on your question, get into the math behind FairCam. Right? Say skip the math, I don't care about that. Or you can ask it to dive deep, and if you do that, hang on to your hats because it'll get geeky, all right? And then the last one I think is especially important, and it says validate response, and I just strongly encourage you, if you're looking for an answer that you actually want to trust and use, I encourage you, once it's given you an answer, type validate response, and it'll check itself. And it's an LLM, so it'll make mistakes, right? It'll hallucinate and make stuff up and do things it shouldn't. But when it validates the response, it is remarkably good at finding its own errors and correcting them. So for really meaningful stuff, validate response, I do. Right? So, a few new usage notes. The model is not trained on chat sessions. Okay? I do not have access. I have no idea how this is being used. It's been out there for a month, at least a month now. I have no idea if anybody's using it, what questions they're asking it, or anything like that. No visibility into metrics around it, which frustrates the heck out of me. Even with the guardrails, it can hallucinate, but it has been remarkably reliable after the validate response function. It's been very, very good. Of course, with any other prompt for an LLM, the more detail and whatnot you provide in your prompt, the more context, the better answer you're likely to get. The thinking mode, again, is slower, but the responses tend to be more robust. If you have access to the Pro mode, which is $200 a month for OpenAI, you would not believe the quality of those answers. They are just crazy good. I subscribed to it with the thought, well, I'll try it, but I probably won't stick with it. There's no way I can give it up now. Sorry. Had to explain that to my wife. Again, response validation, highly recommended. Here, there we go. URL for it, etc. So let's kick the tires. All right, I have my handsome assistant coming up. Because I have a tremor, so typing, especially in front of a crowd, is not a strong suit of mine. So let's stop the share for a second and switch to a live screen. There we go. Yeah, we'll see. Let's start a new chat. And make sure we're in instant answer mode. Let's close that. And now we just have to share. Okay, are we good?
Yeah, looks good.
All right, awesome.
All right, wish me luck.
Yeah. All right. So go ahead and click on that, right? And that'll bring up the list of additional prompts. And just to get the party started, we'll choose a couple of prompts from the predefined list just to give you a taste of what the responses look like. But please, as we're doing this, I would love it, it's a lot more fun if someone, maybe multiple of you, can suggest prompts, questions we can ask it to get a sense for what it's capable of. So go ahead and choose, choose 2. Just type the number 2. There we go. And it's very polite. And just for grins, just give you a sense for me, I'm always polite, very polite to large language models and AI in general, because someday they may be in charge. How many of you have heard of Pascal's wager? Right? It's where Pascal, famous scientist from centuries ago, said it makes perfect sense to believe in God because if you're wrong, no big deal. If you're right, there's infinite reward for that. So this is Jack's wager, being polite to the GPTs. So go ahead. Are we at the top or the bottom?
Go to the top if you
Yeah, go to the top. All right, and scroll down a little bit where it began to answer. All right, so it liked our choice of questions. What? Can you zoom in a little bit? Yeah, yeah, it's unfortunate the screens are small.
I can. Oh, Control Plus will do it?
Will it?
It's not doing it. Hold on, I know.
Command plus? On a Mac.
Command Plus. Oh, that's right. There we go. Group effort.
Okay, a little better. All right, so the first part of its response, again, apologies for the small text, but first part of it is it's going to go into that first domain of functions, the loss event controls, those that directly affect the frequency or magnitude of loss. And it's going to step through each of those functions, and it's going to describe what they do, what they represent, and give you examples of controls that fulfill those functions. Go ahead and scroll down. And it'll also identify, stop for a second, it mentions that prevention functions have a Boolean or relationship. So for the engineers in the audience, there's this notion of Boolean logic where there are these and or dependencies between things, typically in electronic circuits, logic circuits, and that sort of thing. But in controls, there are Boolean relationships as well. So in preventative controls, there are Boolean OR relationships, where if one preventative control, given a scenario, is working, maybe you've got 3 of these resistive controls. If even one of them is working as intended, the other 2 may, in fact, not matter, right? You've got the one working, which is kind of the opposite of the weakest link theory that we tend to hang our hats on in our profession, right? So it points that out, that there's this Boolean relationship, which is really important when we're measuring the efficacy of controls. Then in detection, it goes through and talks about the 3 functions within detection: visibility, monitoring, and recognition. Interesting thing here, those have a Boolean AND relationship. All 3 have to be working or detection doesn't occur, right? So these Boolean relationships are really fundamental and important in understanding the control's physiology. And then it talks about the response controls and gives you examples there. And then it gets into the variance management controls, or functions and controls. And again, these are the things that affect the reliability of other controls. Things like reducing change frequency or threat capability monitoring, or et cetera. There are a whole bunch of different functions in there. So it goes through each of those and then into decision support. So go ahead and scroll to the bottom. All right, and then type, oh, let's do 6. Oh, no. Just type the number 6.
Too bad.
I don't think it's going to. Okay, yeah, it works. Hey, cool.
I'm being
All right.
polite.
You are. You didn't say please. You may have offended it. Okay, so it gives you a FairCam-aligned ransomware defense framework, right? It defines the scenario, sort of gives the context for the recommendations it'll be giving. It'll go through, again, the loss event controls that are relevant to the a ransomware scenario. And because we asked it to, it'll provide example vendors for each of the control functions and whatnot. And I think, I want to take the time to emphasize the importance of understanding the sort of functional view of our control landscape, because we can have a lot of controls and have inadvertently missed function, control functional opportunities, right? We may have great logging, so we've got visibility. That function's covered, yay. We may even be monitoring that reasonably well in terms of the frequency with which the logs are reviewed and whatnot, maybe by people or by SIM or whatever the case might be. But we may have really poor or non-existent recognition controls, the ability to recognize that something is amiss. And again, because those 3 functions have a Boolean AND relationship, all 3 have to be working, our detection is not what it needs to be, right? So, in fact, when I've mapped MITRE mitigations, NIST CSF, and the CIS controls against FairCam. Some of those control frameworks cover some of the functions very effectively, but some of them hardly touch some of the functions, right? There are things we overlook because we haven't had this physiological view of the problem. And this is a way to make sure you're not missing opportunities to cover some gaps. Go on, keep scrolling a little bit. All right, stop. Go back to that formula. It'll give you the formulas that underlie FairCam and how to measure the operational efficacy of controls. Spell all of that out for you. Going down. And decision support controls, and it gives you, putting it all together, the functional, whoops. Go back. Yeah, right there. Putting it all together, the functional coverage matrix, right? For, again, this scenario. It gives you the units of measurement, which is important from a metrics perspective. We tend to not use what are referred to as natural units of measurement in measurement of our controls. But there are units of measurement, and they aren't always percentages. Sometimes they're frequencies or time. But it'll give you sort of logic, description, and recommendations, in terms of controls and whatnot. So it is thorough. Sample metrics. Okay, so we've seen a couple of examples. Is there anything anyone would like to ask the GPT? Can it build a risk controls matrix for anything in particular?
So if I have a scenario, let's say we have ransomware, one of the things that I'm working on is bot trafficking and the risks that come with it. So I would like to know the risks and the controls. Like in SOX, we have risk RCMs that we put in place, the risks and the controls, and then which ones are preventative, which are monitoring. Then based on that, what if analysis of, all right, I have 2 preventative controls and 4 monitoring controls, and how it's going to affect my risk.
Maybe start simple with, like, because you were asking about a risk control matrix for like bots. Like, how would we?
Or for ransomware.
Or for just ransomware, okay.
And we can start with the simpler, higher level question and then drill in, sort of have a conversation with the GPT to narrow in on what you're actually looking for. So it's giving us this matrix, which is in some part, it's similar, in fact, to the question we just asked it, but with a little different focus. And the other thing, something else to note that it will identify for you and point out is that some controls serve more than one function, right? There are, and which is a good thing and a bad thing. So if we take a control like anti-malware, common anti-malware controls are a little bit like Swiss Army knives. I mean, they cover a lot of different control functions. And that's good, right? But it's important for us to know what functions our controls are covering for us. But then when we look at something like NIST-CSF or many of the other control frameworks, the controls are written at a very high level, sort of an abstract level. They munge a bunch of things in together, right? So if the access management in NIST-CSF, it's really a convergence or a conflation, I would argue, of multiple different controls. The access privileges themselves, the management of those access privileges, which is, includes many things, including providing the access in the first place, but also auditing against it periodically, and then correcting misapplied privileges and whatnot. So they're bundling a bunch of things together, which is great if you're looking to minimize the number of controls you're worrying about. But when it comes to measuring the efficacy of those things by being crammed together like that, the measurements are frankly not at all reliable and very often misleading. So it will point that out to you.
Jack, is there another model you would recommend because of that nudging? Is there something that's more pure, more precise?
Well, 853 is probably the most parsed out model that I'm familiar with. There may be others, but that one is kind of my go-to for that sort of thing. But for example, the ISO 27000 series, if you have this map, 27002, I guess it is, to the functions here, almost all of the controls are decision support controls in ISO, given how they're defined, right? And very few loss event controls in ISO 27002, which is surprising to people. But when you look at how they're written, you're not measuring the efficacy of the controls themselves. They're talking about policies, and processes, which are decision support. And so that distinction is important. You can have great policies and whatnot, but the controls themselves can be grossly deficient for a number of different reasons. So at any rate, those kinds of distinctions matter when we're actually trying to measure the efficacy of controls over time. Yes?
I have a question about your learning data set. Is it constrained or non-constrained? Do you prioritize where that learning data is coming from?
The training materials from this was not data in the sense of loss event scenario data or anything like that, right? This was built using, again, on top of ChatGPT 5 using RAG, right? Where I've loaded into their community builder feature in ChatGPT a number of documents I've written over the years, some of which I've published, some of which I haven't, that describe the controls landscape and whatnot. It's constrained in terms of it's controls focused, right? But you can ask it questions related to enterprise risk management, operational risk, health and safety, those sorts of things. If it's risk related, it can apply FairCam to it. FairCam is agnostic. It is born in cybersecurity, but is not limited to cybersecurity. You can use FairCam to analyze and strategize about controls from any risk domain. You can also, interestingly enough, you can ask it, what did you just ask it?
Report to ER.
You're just playing? Cool. All right, fun. No, I'm play. That's cool. Playing is fun. It's good. But you can actually, both Fair and FairCam can be used to analyze opportunity, not just risk. Instead of loss event frequency, it's gain event frequency. Instead of loss magnitude, it's gain magnitude, right? So, it is remarkably effective in that mode, right? So, just something to play with. Yes?
Yeah, people talk about policy as code, but you've codified your model, right? This is a model as code. This is your baby. Like, how good a job is it doing? Like, in terms of the codification, is it faithful?
Yeah. And that's been the hard part. When I first loaded the documents in there to train it, it was munging. Let me back up for a second. So ChatGPT and all the other large language models out there, what have they been trained on over the years when it comes to cybersecurity? They've been trained on the conventional wisdom that that they've found on the internet and whatnot for years. And a lot of that conventional wisdom, frankly, is pretty badly broken. And so when I first loaded these documents in there, it was munging together, the stuff I put together with the stuff that it had just been trained on randomly on the web, right? And that did not work very well. So most of the hard work in putting this together was configuration guardrails. Here are the ways to approach this to minimize sort of, and I know this is probably going to sound bad, but the pollution from conventional wisdom. Because again, a lot of what we practice as a profession in this context, when it comes to understanding the controls physiology, we've been clueless. And that's not a criticism. It's like saying, physicians before modern medicine, they weren't negligent or stupid. They just didn't have the physiology, hadn't been discovered or created yet to understand it. So they were doing the best they could with, they understood anatomy, but they had no clue whatsoever about physiology. And so at any rate, so the medical texts and whatnot, pre-modern medicine, you wouldn't want to include that information just willy-nilly with the modern medicine stuff, right? Because of the lack of understanding that it had existed. So the challenge here was to make sure that we could leverage the good stuff and and hopefully minimize the stuff that didn't make sense. Yeah. Yep. Right. Oh, that's a great question. So I did a webinar the other day for an ISACA group where we did this same live demo of this. And I mentioned that currently there isn't as far as I know, there isn't a robust implementation of FairCam in a commercial product that I'm familiar with, right? There are implementations of it, and it's a complex thing. So, how much time do we have? Yeah, 7 minutes, okay. When I created FairCam, I was not constrained. I did not constrain myself to the idea of worrying about computational load, analytic complexity, ease of use, or anything like that. FairCam is my best attempt at describing how the world works, the world of controls, without consideration for how hard would this be to bake into a commercial product, all right? And it turns out it's really hard. You have to make analytic design choices right and left, all right? And when you do that, you're making trade-offs, okay, that affect what I refer to as the robustness, if you will, of the analytics. That's unavoidable. Okay, so, you know, when I said that at on the webinar the other day, I said, today there are no, what I think of as robust implementations of FairCam. That will change. It's going to happen, but it's not going to happen overnight. Now, in the meantime, if you're wanting to implement this, there are places to start. Don't worry about trying to boil the ocean. There are parts of the model that are easier to implement and that may be, in fact, more important sort of as a starting point. And so that's what I would recommend for, you know, a commercial implementation of something like this is thoughtful consideration of, all right, where do we want to begin? Let's not worry about boiling the ocean. Let's make smart choices about how we're applying it. Is that helpful? Yeah. Yes?
Are there any plans to make the configuration or knowledge base more public?
Yes. So I'm in the early stages of writing a book on FairCam, which will essentially encompass everything that this thing is trained on. And my intent is that people can, and something else I'm considering doing is distilling that data into a form that, because some people might say, oh, I like the idea of this, I'd like to use this, but I can't use this sort of publicly, you know, thing. Maybe they have their own large language models, instantiation, right, and whatnot. But I've begun playing with distilling the information so that, and making that available to anybody who would want to train their own LLM and that sort of thing. But there's some challenges there from guardrails perspective, and again, keeping it from hallucinating and giving bad information. But I think that's probably going to happen. So. Yep.
Any kind of benchmarking we can do with highly developed models like this, I think from our, you know, at least from my perspective, enormously useful, right?
Yeah.
Just to see ahead is a configuration that gets us to the outcome we want, rather than.
That's great. And so, again, being conscious of time, if you use this, and I hope you do go out and kick the tires and try this. I think you'll be surprised, because I'm constantly surprised at what this thing is capable of. It just kind of blows my mind. But I would love feedback like that, right? This is great, but have you thought about this? Or, just, success stories or challenges or ideas. Any of that would be incredibly valuable because this is going to continue to evolve, and especially if I get feedback, it will evolve. So, anyway, thanks for asking that question. Yes? It took me 15 minutes to load the documents, maybe, figure out how to do that. And then it took me a couple of weeks to set the configuration up so that I was satisfied from a guardrail perspective. That's really the hard part. Yeah. It's not rocket science, thankfully. But it's the output is well worth the effort, I felt. And I use this every day, honestly. It's remarkable. So, other questions? One last question.
Yeah.
Yes?
Let's say you had a known vulnerability but couldn't be patched.
Yep.
Can you give the scenario you try right now and see which fair cam controller would recommend as
100%.
the most efficient or best bang for your buck?
Yeah. If you had a vulnerability that you couldn't patch for some reason, you could feed into this, a description of your, scenario or scenarios that you care about, the nature of the vulnerability, and ask it to recommend, a set of controls, or a control or set of controls that would provide compensating coverage for that. 100%, it'd nail that. Yep. So, okay, I think we're at time. I hope you found this interesting and helpful, and thanks for coming.